Hey, Jake Harper here from American Torah. This video is part of my ongoing series on the book of Proverbs, but it's going to be a little bit longer than my usual videos because I'm talking about a more sensitive, politically charged topic than I usually do, and that's social justice. Everybody's talking about it. It's been the hot topic for the last decade. Um, Riots and political demonstrations, universities and schools are teaching it at every level, even making it a requirement to participate in athletic events. You have to go attend a Black Lives Matter riot if you want to continue to play on a sports team, which is a little crazy. Um, Entertainment industry pushes it constantly. HR departments at almost every major corporation are requiring their employees to take classes on diversity and sensitivity. All of these are all social justice topics. In the term social justice, it sounds like a very good thing. Um, God says, justice and only justice you shall follow. Well, this is Moses relaying God's instructions, that you may live and inherit the land that Yahweh your God is giving you. That's Deuteronomy 16:20. So justice is a very important topic to God. This is central to his instructions for Torah, which is God's law. You can't keep Torah without understanding justice. Later in the same book, Deuteronomy 32:4, Moses said, "The rock," referring to God, "his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he." So all of God's ways are justice. If you want to know what justice is, find out what God's ways are. And Solomon said much the same thing in Proverbs 28:4 and 5. Those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but those who keep the law strive against them. Evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek Yahweh understand it completely. In other words, if you reject God's law, you are uh, you are making yourself an enemy of justice. You praise the wicked, and you cannot hope to comprehend what justice even is. But if you keep God's law, if you study it, if you apply it to your life, you will understand justice because you are studying and putting into practice God's own ways, the instructions he has for his people. And that is the definition of justice. Now, everyone's talking about social justice, but from this we can tell, since almost nobody is actually keeping God's law, that very few people even know what it is. Now, I did a little bit of research on the concept of social justice, and um, most people will boil it down to 5 general principles. You may find lists of 3 to 12 different tenets, but for the most part, they can be boiled down to these 5. That's access, equity, participation, diversity, and human rights. Now, let's go through each one of these and see how they measure up to God's actual law. Access refers to equal access to resources such as housing, healthcare, food, education, the things that people need to survive and to get ahead in life. Now, what they really mean by this is the forcible redistribution of resources, not the equal right to obtain those resources or to seek them out or earn them. Now, of course, many social justice proponents will deny that that's what they mean, but that really is what it comes down to. If you want more details on exactly why that's true, I highly recommend the teachings of Vodi Bakum. I'm surprised that YouTube still allows him to be around, but you can find his videos on YouTube and probably other places. I believe he's coming out with a book comparing social justice to biblical justice. Now, the Bible, especially Torah, talks about sojourners and the poor. Now, a sojourner is someone who's landless. When the children of Israel first came into the Promised Land, they divided up the land by lots according to families. And according to God's law, the land is supposed to stay with those families. They can't sell it or give it away. It can't be taken or redistributed to anyone else. The land is inherited from one generation to the next, essentially forever. Dribbling on myself a little bit. Now, there are rules on how you are to treat the sojourners and the landless. Going back to defining what a sojourner is, a sojourner is someone who has come into Israel later. Maybe they are a foreigner visiting, or someone who is converted to worship Israel's God. But because they were not one of the original families who came in with Joshua, they don't have any land to inherit. So they are called sojourners. They may be wealthy, they might be poor. Either way, they're a sojourner. And God also says that the poor are to be treated like the sojourners. A poor person, in this case, is a person with land or an inheritance in Israel, but for whatever reason, he just doesn't have access to the resources he needs. Whether the land is poor, or he's squandered his resources, or maybe there's a drought. Who knows what the problem is? Now, Torah says you're not to mistreat this person. You're to treat them kindly, treat them with respect. The laws about not stealing, all of these things apply to the sojourner and the poor. You're not allowed to steal from them. You're not allowed to abuse them physically or anything like that. They are to have equal access to courts. If somebody has wronged them, they're allowed to go to court and charge that person. They can serve as a witness. You are to allow him to glean from your fields. What this means is that when you harvest your field, you're not supposed to go back and clean up everything that was left behind in the field. You're supposed to let the poor and the sojourners come and harvest that for themselves. You're not supposed to harvest the corners of your fields, but to leave that. Sojourners, landless, the poor, widows, orphans, those people are allowed to come and harvest for themselves. Now, you are not required to go and deliver that produce for them, to harvest it and give it to them. They are required to come and get it from you and to harvest it from your fields when you make it available. But Torah does say that we're to be generous with the poor and the landless. There is a third-year tithe in which a portion of your produce is to be set aside specifically for those people, and they can come to the community storehouse and pick it up. There are no government agencies, nobody with swords or spears or guns in our case, will ever come to your property and force you to give that stuff up for the poor. It is purely voluntary. You're required to do it, but it is on the honor system. The only time anyone truly has equal access to physical resources is in the seventh year, the Sabbath for the land, what's called the Shemitah, or Shemitah. I'm not sure where the stress is on that word. In that year, no mass harvesting is allowed. There's no plowing, no planting, no pruning. Whatever grows of its own, anybody can go and harvest for themselves for that day. You can't go and harvest bushels of produce and then take it to the market and sell it. You harvest what you and your family need, and that's it. And you can harvest from any field. This really comes back to the 9th commandment, which says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's." In other words, you don't have the right to go and take resources that belong to your neighbor for yourself or for anybody else. You can't go and steal from the rich in order to give to the poor. Robin Hood is anti-biblical. That is, as long as he's understood to be stealing from people. There is a right way and a wrong way to care for the poor. The right way, according to God's law, God's ways, which defines justice, is that you allow them to come and glean from the edges and the leavings in your field. You take a portion of your tithe every third year and set it aside for the sojourners and the widows and the orphans. They don't have a right to come and take it by force. God's law is about giving to people, not taking from them. Education is another thing. Education is commanded in Torah, but it's education in Torah. We are commanded to teach our children. We are commanded to hear the law spoken. Um, it's to be the basis for our courts of law. It's to be written on the doorposts of our house. There is no right to education beyond Torah. You have the right to go and educate yourself. You do not have the right to demand education from anyone else outside your house. As a child, you can demand education from your parents. That's it. Let's go on to point number 2, equity. Equity is about, again, the forcible redistribution of resources, but this time to ensure an equal outcome, not to ensure equal access to the resources necessarily, that comes before equity, but to make sure that everybody has an equal outcome. In other words, if whatever system we're using to make sure that people have housing or that people get jobs, if at the end of the day, one class of people has more or better jobs or better pay or better housing or whatever than another class of people on average, that means there's inequity in the system and resources need to be forcibly redistributed to even things out. But as we've already seen from the 9th commandment, thou shalt not steal, this is totally contrary to God's law. The existence of the sojourner and the poor show that this idea of equity is wrong. How could there be sojourners? How could there be poor people for you to be kind to if everyone should have come out at the end of the day with the same amount of wealth? Outcomes in God's law are primarily based on your own performance, on your own choices. Here's another quote from Deuteronomy. This is Moses. If you faithfully obey the voice of Yahweh your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, Yahweh your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. Now, this is not specifically talking about individuals, it's talking about nations. But God is guaranteeing the unequal outcome of nations if you keep God's commandments. Inequity is part of the blessings that God promises to his people for obedience, for faithfulness. Inequity can be a good thing. Wicked people deserve less. Righteous people deserve more. People should be rewarded for the good things that they do, and they should be punished for the bad things that they do. A poor brother in Torah can sell himself. He becomes a slave of a wealthier brother. The wealth of the man who buys the slave is part of God's welfare system. It ensures that the poorer man has a fallback plan, that he will never be so poor that he starves to death, as long as there's someone else around who can buy him. Now, nobody is forced to buy a slave, but this is an option that poor people have. Now, once a man has sold himself as a slave, his master has a responsibility to provide his basic necessities, no more than the basic necessities. He should provide food, housing, clothing. Ideally, he should teach him a skill so that when the man is released from his service, then he can provide for himself. And in the 7th year, God's law commands that a Hebrew who has sold himself into slavery be set free. And at that time, the master is required to give him generous gifts, essentially to prevent him from falling back into poverty and having to sell himself again. But the master is not required to make sure that that man stays free. If he squanders those resources, again, he has to suffer the consequences for his foolish behavior. You seek to improve yourself, not to take what someone else has. And suffering the consequences, unequal outcomes, inequity is a feature, not a bug. This is how God makes people smarter, stronger, and wiser, by suffering the consequences of bad decisions, even if they're somebody else's decisions. We grow as a people by suffering inequities. So let's move on to point number 3, participation. Essentially, this is talking about democracy. Everyone's opinion counts equally. Everyone should have a say in how things are run. But again, this is not God's way. Total democracy it's evil. It's wicked. In a total democracy, the majority always rules. But the majority is usually wrong. It's not a good way to run things. And Torah specifically commands us not to follow the majority to do wrong. If the majority votes to steal people's property and redistribute it, no, you don't go along with that. You oppose it. This is a command from God. Some people have higher responsibility than others in God's plan, so their opinion counts more. You can look at the sacrificial system and see that a ruler's sacrifice is to be larger and more expensive than the sacrifice of a common person. Respected elders of the communities become judges, and you are required to listen to their opinion and obey their rulings. And if you appeal, when you get to the final appeal level, if you don't obey that judge, the penalty is death. So some people's opinions in God's law count more than others. Foreigners have no say at all. They don't get to participate in this except as witnesses. I mean, of course, justice, real justice, the rules apply to foreigners as well. You're not to mistreat a foreigner. If you steal from him, if you hurt him, then he can bring this to a court and seek reparations. But a foreigner can never be king. A foreigner can't be a judge. Those are only Israelites. So point 4 is diversity. And diversity is referring to people with unpopular lifestyles or different ethnic backgrounds, religions, etc. You're not supposed to discriminate against people based on their physical characteristics or their religion or sexual orientation, at least according to social justice proponents. But we all know that this is hypocritical in the extreme, because if you are a Christian, white, heterosexual male, you will be discriminated against. And social justice advocates say this is justice. Don't discriminate, but discriminate. That's craziness. But really, God's law commands discrimination. Not necessarily on the basis of race, although it does in some cases. There are some nationalities which were excluded from joining in the Commonwealth of Israel. In the priesthood, there's definitely some discrimination there. A man can't serve as priest if he has physical defects. The high priest can't have a bald spot. There are no female priests in God's law. When God chose elders and judges and spies and other than prophets, all of the people that God chose to lead his people in the wilderness were men. There are some exceptions. I mean, there's no command against a woman leading the people, but it's just not the norm. God's clear preference is for men to lead his people. And there are some roles from which women are just flat out excluded. As I already said, a woman can never be a priest. So some diversity is a good thing. We should never discriminate against somebody because they're ugly. Outside of the priesthood, we shouldn't discriminate against people because they have a physical handicap. Except for obvious things like employment. You don't hire a one-armed man to carry heavy loads. I mean, that's just common sense. And I think even social justice activists usually are able to wrap their heads around common sense rules like that. Another huge example, homosexuals in God's law are to be executed. A man having sex with a man is totally forbidden. Not only does that man not have a say, he forfeits his very life. We do not tolerate those people. We do not tolerate idolaters, witches. There's some other people a set of people, a religion, so to speak, who is excluded from any participation in public life. They're supposed to be executed. That's some anti-diversity measures there. So some diversity is good in God's law and some is not. And social justice almost exclusively promotes the kinds of diversity that God hates. I'm not talking about racial stuff for the most part. I mean, there are no commands against interracial marriage. There are commands against interfaith marriage. You are to discriminate against people who don't worship the same God you do. You do not marry a pagan. You do not allow a pagan to hold office. You do not tolerate idolatry in your towns. Let's go on to the fifth point, which is human rights. In social justice theory, human rights are essentially whatever people say they are. We get to define what the term right means. We define God for ourselves, essentially. And those are subject to change at any time. If the majority of people now say that it's a human right to have grass in your lawn, well, then it must be so. But really, the only rights that people have are whatever is required to carry out God's commandments. For example, we have the right to assemble because we are commanded to assemble, and we are commanded to, God's law specifically says that we can produce food and sell it. We can go to the market. You can't go to the market if you can't assemble with other people, if you can't travel. So there are lots of things that people have to be allowed to do by implication. We have the right to a public trial with witnesses, to confront the people who have accused us of a crime. That's all laid out in God's law. We have the right to defend ourselves and our family, our community, our property, our nation. That requires that we have the means to defend those things. We are required to worship God, therefore we have a right to. We have a right to go to the temple if there was a temple. We have a right to assemble on the seventh day. We have a right to hire and fire people. We have a right to hire ourselves out. We have a right to work our own land and to sell the produce of it, to earn a living and to amass wealth. And we have a right to protect that wealth from people who want to take it and redistribute it. There are some things that Scripture says are not rights, and I've talked about several of those already. You do not have a right to worship idols or to worship any God except the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac. Got those a little mixed up, but you know who I mean. You do not have a right to have sex with whoever you want. A man does not have a right to have sex with a man, or with his sister, or his aunt. Those things are forbidden, and the people who do them are to be executed, or at least exiled in some cases, by God's law. You don't have a right to take other people's property. The real motives of social justice advocates, they want to think, many of them really believe, that they are trying to better the state of mankind, that they are trying to be good and right wrongs in the world. But the people who are really behind it, they're doing it not because they want the world to be a better place, or not necessarily because they want to be kind to people. They're doing it because they hate God. That's really what it boils down to. They hate God, they hate God's ways, and they will do everything that they can. They will lie, they will cheat, they will start wars to excise God and his law from all of society. And we have a responsibility to stand up to that. We are commanded to pursue justice, and those people are anti-justice. The social justice theory, this insanity that people call social justice, is anti-God, it's anti-Bible, it's anti-justice. It is exactly the opposite of what they say it is. And we have a responsibility to stand up against it, to say, no, that's not justice. God's law is justice. Whatever you're doing, if it doesn't align with God's commandments, then it is not justice. This is Jake Harper from American Torah. Be blessed, fear God, and keep his commandments, because that is justice.